Welcome to the Music Life podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Zach Condon from the band Beirut. Music Life is a show where 4 artists from around the world get together to discuss all aspects of our lives in sound. Today I'm joined by Stephin Merritt and Debbie, Harry, and Chris Stein from Blondie. We'll be talking about the myth of self-expression as an artist, the influence your location, in our case New York, has on songwriting, and what unexpected musical genres we might get musical influences from. So, let's get started.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I should be able to see that. Yeah. Chris is pointing at Debbie, I think.
I have to turn off the phone.
Okay. Ready? I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and raised in the city of Santa Fe, and from a young age absorbed a vast array of musical influences. When I was 14, my older brother moved to New York and left behind a strict musical education of minimal German electronica, hip-hop, and mixtapes of Neutral Milk Hotel. From there I began recording little tunes with a trumpet, a drum machine, a synthesizer, and my father's acoustic guitar, before being opened up to new styles and instrument obsessions like the organ. I never really played live until my first record was picked up by a New York record label called Bada Bing in 2006. I went on to record 8 studio albums and tour all over the world. Our new album, Hadsel, came out on the 10th of November and is named after the northern Norwegian island where I spent time in 2020 and where I recorded most of the album. Take tonight to your home. Lay me down my oar. I can turn to your arms. Joining me today are 3 incredible musicians who have always been a huge source of inspiration. First up, a singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist who is best known for fronting the Magnetic Fields, one of the most important indie rock bands of the last 30 years. He is renowned for his beautiful melodies and rich lyrics, meticulously crafting soundscapes using a variety of acoustic, electronic, and improvised instruments. It's Stephin Merritt. How are you? Where are you? And what have you been up to recently?
I have a cold, so I sound hoarse. I'm in New York City. Everyone else has a cold, I think. And I'm preparing to go on tour next month. We're doing Europe.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Oh, then maybe I could catch you out here if you come through Berlin.
I don't think we're going to Berlin, but we're going to Athens and Helsinki and Istanbul, where I have not been before.
Okay.
Nice.
Somebody not too bright, but sweet and kind, who would try to get you off my mind. I could leave this agony behind, which is just what I'd do if I wanted to, but I don't want to get over you.
And finally, we have 2 members of one of punk and pop's most influential bands. They formed in 1974 in New York and were pioneers of the city's new wave scene, going on to top the charts around the world with hits such as Atomic, Heart of Glass, and Hanging on the Telephone. They've gone through many lineup changes over the years, but has been held together by 2 amazing musicians we have with us today. It's Debbie, Harry, and Chris Stein from Blondie. The same, how are you, where are you, and
Hello.
What have you been up to?
Me, I have just finished a memoir that I worked on actually writing myself with my fingers for 2 years pretty much. I tried to remember as much as I possibly could. Luckily, I have all the photography, which, triggers my memories. I'm not doing the touring anymore because I'm just too beat up. So I leave that to Debbie and the younger guys.
And Debbie, what have you been up to?
Well, I guess, it's a little bit of gigging and a little bit of travel. I actually sang on a track with John Roberts, who is the voice of Linda on Bob's Burgers. And he's an old friend. He's a very funny man. He's a stand-up comic as well as a musician. We finished an album and they're mixing it now. I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
pleased with
I
that.
always like doing new music, it's really such a challenge.
Yeah.
Zach is on there a bit.
Okay,
too.
so that made it. I was gonna
Yeah. Oh
ask.
yeah. Sure. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
did
yeah.
get 2 other guys to complete the whole horn section, but we're in there.
That's understandable with the part
Yeah.
that you sent me, I think. So.
So were you guys recording by mail?
Pretty much.
We had just him.
Uh-huh.
Everybody else was in there together.
Because I wanted to say that in relation to the question about where you are influences the music, I feel like that's kind of an obsolete question because now where we are, we're at home. And
Yeah.
most of us are recording at home.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking earlier, because I was going over these questions in my head, and I was thinking that for Chris and Debbie back in the day, there was no such thing as like the lone wolf multi-instrumentalist band. I mean, sure, there was 1 or 2, but that wasn't
Todd
the
Rundgren.
norm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for example, Todd Rundgren. But in general, it wasn't just like, I'm going to do all of this myself in my bedroom as I see fit when I have the time. It was very much like you guys had to get face-to-face time.
You needed those big machines too, you know. It was
That,
all.
yeah.
I always had a TAC 4-track. That was my weapon of choice for many, many years.
I got rid of my TIAC when I discovered that there was a spider living in it that had created a spider web.
I'm just hoping that the spider web would have been an integral part of the sound somehow, but
I think it just prevented the motor from moving.
I feel like that question is that's a hard one for me to explain why I wanted to ask it.
So I just read the 33 1/3 book about parallel lines, and it's just so jarring to me that you were recording in LA.
No, Parallel Lines was New York. Auto American was in LA. The one that has Rapture and Tide is High, that was in LA. Parallel Lines is Record Plant, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there a difference for you in recording in LA versus New York?
No, LA was great. I mean, Mike Chapman, he worked so hard. It was kind of crazy. So we kind of thought, okay, we'll give him a break, go to his home turf. And it was very rewarding and weird. And for Auto American, there were all those people, you know. We had that orchestra. There was a bass player in the orchestra who had played on the Lawrence of Arabia soundtrack. This is something I always recount. And that just blew my mind because I grew up listening to film music before I was into pop music. And we had Ray Brown and Tom Scott. Flo and Eddie came in and sang on 1 or 2 tracks, just all this stuff.
That defines LA, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was very exciting, really was. Getting all that coordination. It was pretty cool.
I was going to ask what drew you guys there, because it's like Blondie is mentioned in the same breath as New York so often, especially when it comes to kind of downtown music, 70s and so on. And for me, like, I was listening to your music, Stephen, when I was a teenager. And to me, your music represented like a new thing in New York, not like a movement or anything as far as I could tell, but it just represented something that I wanted to be around. And so I was kind of called to it for these reasons. So I was wondering how you ended up there in some ways and why you ended up there. But it sounds like you were just
really, except for 6 years in LA, it's never really occurred to me to live anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a house in Hudson for 10 years, but that was suburban New York, basically.
I grew up in Brooklyn, and it was just what one did. One went into Manhattan daily or semi-daily or whatever.
Right. Well, I grew up in this small town, and all eyes were on New York,
Yeah.
And that was how it always felt. And then I got there, and I think what I liked about it at the time, especially coming from the small town, was this feeling that the people there were like genuinely devoted to their craft. I mean, where I come from, everything is like, oh, we'll do it mañana. Like, we'll just do it later. We'll do it later. It's like there's no kind of seriousness to anything that's being done. So when I got to New York, I felt like I was around serious people for the first time. And Debbie, you're from New Jersey.
Yeah, that's where I grew up in North Jersey, but I always felt that New York was like Mecca. It was kind of this irresistible magnetic force. and that there was really no place else to go.
Why Berlin?
I don't really have a great reason for Berlin, but I first came here when I was 19, and something about it really kind of blew me away. And it was the middle of February, and it was rather dark and rather cold. I mean, at the time, back in 2003, there were still kind of giant empty spaces between all the buildings where the bombs had been, and they hadn't fully reconstructed the way they have now. And this kind of mixture of that and the Soviet architecture and all this other stuff just got me really fascinated. It just got my brain kind of running 1,000 miles an hour. And I think, unfortunately for me, I'm a sucker for stories. And so I was just looking for like a story in my head. And something really stuck with me about the place. And then a lot of my music started talking about the place without me really realizing or knowing why. And I'm still not 100% sure. And so New York actually kind of drove me away. I felt like I lived there for almost 11 years. And I felt like I couldn't keep up with the cycles of the place. Like, I'm imagining you guys being there in the 70s and then seeing everything that's changed. Like, is it even the same city? That kind of thing. And I would leave on tour for 2 or 3 months, and I'd come back and there'd be like glass and steel condos popping up in a way that I couldn't even get around my old neighborhood,
Yeah.
It got to this point where I felt like I had been kind of eaten up and spit out, which is, I guess, the cliche, right, of some small town bumpkin kind of going to the city and trying their hand at it.
LA maintains more of its weird old funkiness than New York does at this point.
My ideas about Berlin are mostly from reading Bowie in Berlin.
Yeah, right. He would have been out in Schöneberg, which is this really beautiful, but at the time, I think, very quiet part of the West before the wall came down.
Yeah, we were there in wall days.
Were you?
We were there
Okay,
in the
yeah,
wall.
you'd seen it.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We went to Checkpoint Charlie one time,
Yeah.
and I had a little flash camera, and I was taking pictures with the flash, and all of a sudden, from the other side of the wall, somebody started popping flash pictures off like they were, okay, you're taking our picture, we're going to take your picture. It was just bizarre, but
So you
all
have
that
files
stuff,
on
yeah.
you in the old GDR then, don't you?
Hey, I always want to get my mugshots from Berkeley in 1968, but I never thought about that. Yes.
Well, they would have also been sneaking your music in through the
Oh, yeah.
GDR.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all
yeah.
that stuff. Well, that was Russian X-ray discs.
Right.
Was
Well, to get
fascinating.
into Berlin, we had to go through that corridor.
The corridor.
We had to
the
drive
highway.
through the corridor. And that
Yeah,
was
through East Berlin.
a revelation.
Well, they
Yeah.
kept it really nice. It was like a Boy Scout camp. All the buildings and stuff you'd see on this ride were like very bucolic and pleasant. And you knew if you went 2 blocks deeper, it would be all destroyed and miserable.
No, that was really not my impression. My impression was that it was
destroyed for you.
It was destroyed, yeah. Just a ruin, basically. I remember seeing old farmhouses with thatched roofs, broken farm tools in the yard, and,
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and this is Music Life. I'm Zach Condon, joined by Stephin Merritt and Debbie, Harry, and Chris Stein from Blondie. This actually comes a bit from my kind of youth in this like hippie enclave of Santa Fe, which is this kind of overblown myth, the way I see it anyway, of creation and all art in general just being some aspect of self-expression. And I actually found that to be an almost selfish notion, like that's all it would be, when to me, I mean, it's used in this way that it's like, it's the most important purpose of our life is to express ourselves or something like this, and everything else is secondary and less important. And I find that that's actually led to a lot of kind of almost entitled or self-aware stuff that I don't really love. But the way I more see it is like in the actual moment of creating something, to me it always felt more like channeling something else. It had little or nothing to do with myself. And I felt like everything I did was very unintentional, and I really loved that. And so I was wanting to hear if you guys felt the same way or if you had a completely different take on it. Yeah.
It's hard to say. I mean, self-expression as opposed to wanting attention, because that's always a component of what we do, I think, or
Right.
approval or something like that. And maybe that comes into all art. I mean, was Van Gogh disappointed that he wasn't selling paintings? I don't know. He seems to have been. But yeah, I mean, channeling stuff. I mean, I've always been a one for putting pieces together. As soon as I started really working with computer programs, I was really great for just finding loops and all kinds of weird little samples and throwing all that together.
When you started earlier, you were saying this reel-to-reel tape or this
Yeah.
4-track tape. Were you basically looping yourself and
No, like
composing all the different
I would
parts?
go, man, really early, damn, like 71, 72. I knew a kid who was a drummer in Brooklyn. So I would take a cassette machine to his house and play like rhythm guitar, and he would bang on the drums. Then I would take it back to Manhattan, and that would be one track. And then I would overdub 3 tracks of guitars or a bass and 2 guitars and stuff like that. So that was going on. It wasn't loops. I mean, loops were later in life with the computers.
I really enjoyed working with tape loops. When I went to recording school, they taught us the correct method of doing tape loops, but I'd actually been using the ones that you get on a cassette for your answering machine.
Nice. Yes, right. Those
Like,
things, those
20
cassettes.
second long.
Yeah, those were awesome. Right. Yeah.
I missed those.
Well, Stephen, I feel like if anyone's music was like intentionally made, like you had a kind of goal in mind and a roadmap to get there, it seemed like your music often was. And I was always wanted to ask things like, did you write the lyrics first and then the music later? Or is it something that you also kind of go into like a trance-like state and you snap out of it and you look at what you've done and say, oh, that's nice how that turned out?
Well, I sit around in gay bars with a pen in my hand and a cocktail in the other, and sometimes I don't remember writing the song because I wrote it too late at night and I was drunk by that point. But usually I remember writing the song, and the happy accidents are baked into how I write the songs. Like, I don't even start until I've had one cocktail that turns off my internal superego horror movie mother editor.
But you write lyrics first?
Accidents.
I
write them both at the same time.
simultaneously.
Yes.
Because we always would write the music first.
So Chris and Debbie, when you're writing, I mean, how much of that stuff was written together? Are you both in the room together, that kind of
Generally,
thing?
I would do a tape demo and present it to Debbie, and then she would lay stuff on it. But she would also heavily influence the melodies. And then the lyrics would generally be overlaid. I remember, early on, maybe something like In the Flesh, those early songs we might have written, both of us in the same place. And, we would work up lyrics. I mean, Rapture, all that kind of stuff when we were working in the studio. We would bounce off each other.
Sometimes Chris would, if he was working on a track, he would always sort of have like a mantra going
I
in
would
his
have
head,
a phrase sometimes.
and I would always ask him what that was, if he had one.
That would maintain. It's like allegedly Paul McCartney called yesterday Scrambled Eggs, set the song Scrambled Eggs. Da, 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 da. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I've always heard.
Stephen, as far as I know, you record mostly alone, right?
I record alone at first, and then I put the other people on afterwards.
Right. Like I was saying earlier, that's like something that never existed before. So it's like entirely on our own heads.
But I grew up with a 4-track, so I've been doing that since 1978. So
Okay.
for me, that's the normal way of working.
Have you ever done collaborations like in person as if it were a band?
You mean writing,
I don't
two
know.
people writing in a room?
2 or 3 people in a room, like a practice space, whatever.
No.
Because I've tried and it's always failed for some reason.
The band, I mean, that's like what the drummer always says. Yeah, let's go in and we're going to jam and we'll come out with a song. It never happens,
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, actually, I was briefly in a rock group in 1980 or something, and we tried that.
I mean, there's
Didn't work.
the
Yeah.
Godard movie, the Sympathy for the Devil movie, which I am very fond of. It seems like they're in there for a week working up Sympathy for the Devil. It just seems like interminable, and eventually they get it.
Yeah, just as a last moment on that thought, Debbie, does that sound true that art and music is self-expression at its core, or does it seem like something else to you?
Well, for me, a lot of it is observation, really, and I guess a bit of a mixture. I like driving around, I get a lot of ideas in motion, the sounds of repetitive sounds. And it's sort of funny because it's very annoying, but yet it does something to your brain.
Gary Newman writes all of his songs in his car.
Yeah, I can see that.
Look, human art and music is all derivative. So there is this quality of sort of a hive mind thing going on. It's not all, I mean, self-expression seems very personal, but it's all based on stuff you've heard and stuff you've seen too. So.
Yeah, that's something I can relate to, because for me it always felt like I just heard enough damn songs that I could spit out the logical next note on a good day.
No, I used to play that game as a kid. That was my game.
Yeah. You know, when I was a little kid, I used to think that there were only so many melodies left, and that if I didn't hurry up and write, that they would all be taken by the time I was like a young adult or something.
That's not unreasonable.
Yeah.
I think theft is more important than self-expression.
Yeah.
The self that you really want to express is your taste in music.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
Whether you were abused at certain points by certain adults as a child, that's not the important thing about you musically. I think there's about the same amount of self-expression in writing songs as there is in DJing. You're showing people what you like.
Yeah.
That's a hot take. Yeah.
Or cooking, it's like, I am from this culture. We eat macaroni and cheese. I happen to like it with nutritional yeasts. And that's what I'm expressing. And here's some macaroni and cheese I made for you. I'm expressing that I care enough about you to make you food. But I'm not expressing the terrible things that happened to me in my childhood.
Yeah.
See, this is the angle that I hadn't really put to words, but that's what I meant by kind of seeing it being taken in the wrong way, and with the self-expression to such an extreme that it ends up being this kind of overly self-focused pursuit.
No, self-expression
overly
is
self-aware.
It's
even.
just a little facet of art and music.
Yeah.
It's not,
It falls out through the cracks. You know,
I sometimes feel like it's better than me, that it is partially channeling,
Yeah,
Totally.
for sure.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I like what you said, Chris, about almost like tapping into a hive mind.
Yeah.
Like whether we know it or not, maybe the good ones are the ones that tap into it the best.
Yeah, I mean, we never knew which songs were going to be hits or successful. I mean, you wanted people to like what you were doing. I mean, does really anybody produce music or art and not care at all if somebody likes it? I don't know. I guess there must be some people doing that. But, the only song I knew was going to be a hit was Tide is High. That's the only one.
You can't tell me that when you guys wrote Heart of Glass that you weren't kind of bouncing off the walls of the studio.
No, it was just in there with the other stuff.
Wow.
The album Parallel Lines was on the charts for 6 months before they had the wisdom to release that song as a single.
The first time I ever heard Heart of Glass, I was in a car with my uncle, who was a huge disco dancer, my grandmother, who only liked Barbra Streisand, and my mother, who only liked folk music and maybe folk rock. And all four of us were like, I've never heard anything like this before. So there is a certain self-expression in that you guys were able to do something that had never been done before. You were kind of curating the punk rock attitude toward the disco moment, but really it transcends both of those supposed genres.
Well, for me, the big deal about that song was just getting the rhythm machine and the synth to sync up. Because this was before it was.
Well, also getting you're doubling the vocal in 2 different octaves, right? And it sounds like one person.
It was
amazing.
Before MIDI.
Yeah,
it was
voltage
controlled.
Right, getting 2 analog things to stay in sync.
I think I have. It's the CR78.
Yeah, CR78.
Right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. I have one here. At least they have a trigger out.
Yes, it has a trigger out. Put down a little pulse, then we got a writer's credit on "Work It." Because Missy sampled, but she didn't. She could have just gone and bought the drum machine, but they used the sample from the track, which is great.
Wow. I actually wanted to ask you guys, because you mentioned the influence of disco on that, for example. One thing about Blondie that was so interesting, like you guys kind of broke hip hop in a big way too. Like you guys were like dabbling in all these things that punk seemed to kind of hold its nose up
I always liked
against.
disco music. It was just an extension of R&B for me. I never had any problems with it. I like dance music. I always liked Four on the Floor. Just generally, I always thought there should be more of that in rock music.
Do you think punk was more open then? And then it closed up more in my generation, for example?
Yeah,
So because if I were to play a disco song to like my punk friends in high school, I would have been kicked out of the club.
Yeah. I mean, Talking Heads loved that too. They were doing all that.
Yeah, they were.
Just don't join a club that you're going to be kicked out
Yeah.
of for your taste in music.
No, I mean, later in the 80s when, the hardcore / punk, all that stuff had a narrower scope, I think, than the early days when we were coming up.
Well, I don't know why, but it sort of made sense to me that somehow the sound or the lack of the sound of guitars really made people panic.
I can know what the chords are.
Yeah, where are the chords? That's really funny because I often felt like my entire career was built around the novelty of not having a guitar.
Yeah.
In some ways. And the fact that what I was mentioning earlier about being kicked out of the club, right? There was nothing but punk bands where I was, but I was so uninterested in some ways with the monotony of the kind of distorted guitar that came out of that. And so I was always looking elsewhere. And so I was drifting further and further abroad with sounds kind of going, oh, what are they doing in Turkey? What are they doing here? What are they doing there?
Well, I know I was always, roots music was always a huge deal to me. I've been into this modern Latin music for 15 years or more. I kind of knew reggaeton was going to cross over, and now it's ubiquitous. The dembo beat is everywhere.
Stephen, do you have any like left field influences that one would not normally suspect or hear in your music?
So talking of Latin forms that most Americans can't identify, I find these not in the real world, but on drum machines. And for me, the equivalent of Four on the Floor, the thing that first occurs to me to put into a track, is the bossa nova beat from the Casio VL tone.
Yeah.
That for some reason, it's in my dreams.
I buy all my drum
thing.
machines only for the Latin section, and I do the exact same thing.
Right, because who wants to hear rock too, other than da da da?
Yeah. No, the Heart of Glass, it's like 2 presets on that thing. I can't remember what they are, but they're both Latin beats, rumba and mambo or something like that together.
I love the old style where you can play both at the same time.
Yeah.
Just by pressing both buttons at the same time.
That is a fun one. Yeah, they're just so much more kind of playful and wide open with the percussion stuff.
That. Well, also the dembo beat, which is your basic reggaeton beat, is just so sexy to me because it's all slower too. It's like 90 BPMs always, That, it's just, and it just always hit me.
For me, new instruments equals new sounds, new songs usually, but I feel like I reached a point where I was looking at it and I was like, I could keep going down this road, but what will this do to me?
So instead, you have gone full circle and taken up the organ, I read on your website.
Yeah, exactly. I went back.
I had organ lessons in high school.
Wow.
So
Oh, really?
I had this terrible problem where I am not a Christian, so I couldn't find a church to practice in.
Mm-hmm.
So I never got good at playing those feet.
All the things,
Yeah.
And I didn't realize I could just buy a farfisa.
Yeah, they were a dime a dozen
Yep.
for a long time. Yeah. No, I could never get the pedals either. I'm totally self-taught, so it's like I actually started playing piano when my left wrist was in a cast, and so with my left hand, I'm like a Neanderthal. I just kind of hit it with one finger, just following the root tones, basically. But
the great thing about church organ is absolutely anything you play sounds incredible.
Magnificent, yes.
it can. But I feel like I always try to find these instruments that other people's view as novelty, and then I try to kind of get something more musical out of them. I don't know if that's... I kind of picked up the ukulele because of you, Stephen, actually. There you go.
Uh-oh. Excellent.
That's good.
Very musical.
Yeah. I just used that in a cover of Beware of the Blob.
Nice.
It worked really well.
It's a good song.
Yeah, first Bacharach hit.
Really?
Really?
Yeah, it's his first top 40 hit.
Really?
He always did have a sense of humor. You did.
I have a lot to learn from you. That's
Yeah.
Is there something that you wanted to talk about just as far as creativity goes, or do you think it's over talked about? How about that?
I think creativity is not the point, is my take on this. It's like stick-to-itiveness is more important than creativity, I
Yes,
think.
perhaps, yeah.
You have to be dedicated, and it doesn't so much matter what you're dedicated to, because that's going to change anyway. But like you were saying, you moved to New York because people were serious here. Yeah, it's not what they were serious about, it was that they were serious.
Thanks so much to my guests this week, Stephin Merritt and Debbie Harry and Chris Stein from Blondie. And thanks for listening. I'm Zach Condon from Beirut. Head to the website for more Music Life shows, bbcworldservice.com/musiclife. Before we go, do you have any projects out now or coming up that you'd like to tell people about?
I'm touring Europe in November and doing 69 Love Songs 25th Anniversary Tour in 2024.
We have Blondie record coming. I have my memoir coming. Various other things that are still under the radar.
I'm excited about that. Yeah, I'm releasing a new album too, Hadsel.
Oh, that's great.
That's great.
Are you the only person playing on it?
Yeah, it's just me on this one.
Nice.
Good.
That was partially COVID related and partially me having had kind of a nervous breakdown on tour and just
So it's
not
your
wanting-
Nebraska.
Yeah, exactly. That would be
No.
lovely.
Everyone should do a Nebraska.
Everyone's got to do one, yeah. Yeah, I didn't want to get people involved. It just didn't feel right. Nice to see all of you.
Nice to see you guys. It's great to see
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll get together sooner than later.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, thank you.